to be had in the coming year.
Dr. Jackie Bloom.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to take a very short call on the second reading of this bill. It is a very straightforward bill, Mr. Speaker. It bridges the gap between the current regime, which expires at the end of this month, while waiting for the passage of the 2011 bill. Mr. Speaker, this government is serious about putting victims at the heart of the justice system and focusing on the rights of victims, and I support this bill and commend it to the House.
Chris Farfoy.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to this bill. This bill will expire, or this legislation, substantive legislation, Mr. Speaker, will expire in 9 days' time, and that's why we are here extending for 1 more year the sunset clause, which is in the Prisoners and Victims Claims Act 2005. And Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to see that the members on the opposite side of the House this afternoon taking very short calls, because earlier in the first reading of this bill, Mr. Speaker, the member from Hamilton West, someone who I have a lot of personal respect for, a fair degree of, someone who I have a fair degree of personal respect, Mr. Speaker, was beaming about this bill. He actually said it was part of the government's arsenal of initiatives. Tim McIndoe said that this bill was, but Mr. Speaker, today the praise around this bill is a tad shorter. But Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting this legislation, because, as I said, it is because. Because, as I said, it is a pure extension of the bill that Mr. Goff introduced back in 2005. And because when we introduced and passed that bill in this House, there was a perceived need, following the court ruling that Charles Chevelle mentioned earlier on, that there was concern around compensation given to prisoners, and then the lack of that compensation being passed on to their victims. And then at the time of its introduction, the Honourable Phil Goff, who is sitting to the right of me, said at the time of introducing this, to the right, to the right of me, at the substantive legislation being passed, Mr. Goff said, "Most people believe it is wrong that offenders should be compensated for wrongful treatment, but in turn are not required to pay restitution to the victims they harmed." And that was made in the context of the time, given the court case that I mentioned earlier, and also a feeling amongst the community that there was a sense of unease around what was happening. But as Mr. Chevelle pointed out earlier also, and also in his first reading speech, that it was a response to a perceived need at the time. Now, for those who might be watching or listening at home on their crystal sets, for the benefit of those people, this bill essentially extends the sunset clause. A pale imitation of John Banks. That's some praise. This bill essentially extends the sunset clause of the substantive legislation, which, as I said earlier, expires on the 1st of July, for 1 year, in order for this government to address this area of law. I will repeat. It has two main functions. The first one, that it restricts the circumstances where the courts can award prisoners compensation for any breach of their rights while they are locked up. The court must consider other remedies before it looks at monetary compensation for those inmates, and also investigate whether a prisoner has extinguished all other complaints procedures before they can go to the monetary compensation that might be available to them. So, in essence, it needs to be an exceptional case before a prisoner can be awarded any monetary compensation for any abuse of their human rights. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, the Act also sets out a process where, if a prisoner were to receive any compensation in one of those rare cases for a rights breach, that their victim can claim against it if they are owed any money, and that's what is called the victim's claim process in the bill, Mr. Speaker. And that compensation money is paid into a trust account, of course, after lawyers are paid, and victims have 6 months in order to lay a claim against those monies that are in that trust account. So that's the function of this legislation, and for that reason, Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting the bill that is before the House. But, Mr. Speaker, that is not what the story is about, because the functions of this bill are 7 years old. And I'd just like to echo the comments of the Green Party member David Clendon as to why we actually are before this House again to extend the sunset clause within this bill. And it is because while the government has talked tough on law and order, this bill is part of their arsenal of initiative of an arsenal. Well, I don't think it's an initiative's arsenal, basically. But, Mr. Speaker, the government has failed to address this issue, which it said it was going to tackle back in 2008. So, for the second time within this government's term, we are back here extending the sunset clause within this bill. And, Mr. Speaker, if you can give me the chance just to have a look at this, it's almost to the date that we are back in this House extending the sunset clause. So they have been rushing the process this time, and 2 years ago when we extended it previously, they were rushing the process as well, because, Mr. Speaker, this bill on the 22nd of June 2010 received its third reading. Mr. Speaker, on the 22nd of June 2010, this was in the Committee of the Whole House. And, Mr. Speaker, on the 22nd of June 2010, this bill, the predecessor to this bill, received its second reading. So, Mr. Speaker, again, this government has been caught out rushing through a temporary measure to extend this legislation that was passed under the previous Labor government, because it could not get its act together and come up with a decent alternative that it had promised to the people of New Zealand. Because, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that said it took victims' rights seriously, but has twice had to extend the sunset clause within this legislation that Mr. Goff passed back in 2005. Now, the legislation was experimental, and as Charles Chauvel said, and that's why the sunset clause was built into it. But, Mr. Speaker, for a party that says it's taking law and order seriously and is right behind victims, it's finding itself for the second time, almost 2 years to the day, in a rush to try and make sure that it can get this sunset clause extended so it doesn't look embarrassed, because there's no mechanism for victims to try and get any compensation from prisoners. So, Mr. Chair, I think that speaks volumes as to what kind of commitment this government has to victims' rights, when it's talked tough, but it hasn't walked the walk in this Parliament, because, as I said, exactly nearly 2 years ago, we were doing exactly the same thing. So, Mr. Speaker, the story that this government wants out in the paper tomorrow is that this bill passed and they're getting tough on time. It's part of their arsenal of initiatives. But the true story is, Mr. Speaker, it's had 3.5, nearly 4 years to sort this out, and it hasn't done a single thing. There is, I understand, an alternative piece of legislation on the order paper, but where has it progressed? Where has it progressed? This government, again, is buying itself another year in this House today. Another year to sort itself out. It cannot, Mr. Speaker, it cannot get itself organised enough to get legislation through this House to make sure it can walk the walk on its talk on the election campaign. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago we were doing exactly the same thing. So, Mr. Speaker, another part of our argument as to why this government hasn't walked the walk is that there needed to be a review of this legislation to see if it was being effective. And 3 years ago, when it came into office, that was one of the options that it looked at, but there was no review. There was no review, and we've also got no legislation before us. So, in terms of a rolling maul on its arsenal of initiatives and its 120-point plan, as Mr. Little says, to crack down on crime and its war on P and whatever other mottos that this government has around crime and law and order, this government is not necessarily walking the walk when it talks the talk. So, Mr. Speaker, Leanne Dalziel spoke earlier about what the regulatory impact statement said, and I think that speaks volumes as to just how rushed this process has been. And let me quote from it, Mr. Speaker. Where are we exactly? There's a lot to consider in this. The Prisoners Victims Amendment Bill was introduced to give effect to the redirection policy but did not receive a first reading. There is now insufficient time to progress it through its parliamentary stages before the sunset clause takes effect on the 1st of July 2012 in 9 days' time, Mr Speaker. So that's the first piece of information to show you how slack this government has been. Due to this, the Ministry of Justice was asked to urgently consider alternative options to maintain the existing provisions to the PVC Act until the redirection policy can be given effect. The RIS was prepared within a very short time frame and accordingly no
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member.
was undertaken.
His time has
Sums it
expired.
all up.
I call Katrina Shanks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.